Antonio Banderas had spent decades living the Hollywood dream. Fame, money, unforgettable movies, and a career that took him from Spain to the biggest stages in the world. To millions of fans, he seemed to have everything a person could want. Then, one morning, his heart gave him a warning he could never ignore. What happened next changed the way Antonio Banderas looked at his entire life. The surprising part is that years later, he would describe that terrifying experience as one of the best things that ever happened to him. But why would a heart attack become a turning point he could eventually be grateful for? To understand that, we have to go back to the life he had built before everything changed. Antonio Banderas grew up in Málaga, Spain, with dreams of becoming an actor. Long before Hollywood knew his name, he was working in Spanish theater and film, determined to build a career through acting. His talent eventually brought him to the attention of filmmaker Pedro Almodovar. Their collaborations helped introduce Banderas to international audiences, and Hollywood soon came calling. The transition was not easy. He was entering an industry where few Spanish actors had achieved lasting international fame. But Banderas had something difficult to ignore: presence. He could be romantic, dangerous, funny, dramatic, and mysterious, sometimes within the same career. Then came the roles that made him a global star. He appeared in films such as Philadelphia, Desperado, Evita, and The Mask of Zorro. Suddenly, the actor from Malaga had become one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. Zorro made him a major international star. His smile became famous, his voice became instantly recognizable, and his career continued moving forward. But success can create an illusion. When everything is going well, it becomes easy to believe that tomorrow will look exactly like today. Antonio was living at a pace that seemed almost impossible to stop. Then came 2017. One night, Antonio Banderas suffered a heart attack. He was rushed for medical attention, and doctors placed 3 stents to help keep his arteries open. For a man who had spent years portraying larger-than-life characters, this was a moment when there was no script and no character to hide behind. There was only reality, his own mortality. The experience forced him to confront something that fame had allowed him to avoid thinking about. Life was not guaranteed. The career could continue, the movies could continue, the success could continue, but none of it mattered if he did not have his health. And this is where his story takes an unexpected turn. Instead of allowing the experience to become only a frightening memory, Antonio began changing the way he lived. He stopped smoking, he became more conscious of his health, and perhaps most importantly, he began reconsidering what he actually wanted from the rest of his life. For years, Hollywood had been the center of his professional world, but after the heart attack, another place began calling him back: Malaga, the city where his story had started. The contrast was striking. He had spent decades traveling between countries, movie sets, premieres, and international events. Now, the place that once seemed like the beginning of his story became part of his future. Antonio began investing more of his time and energy into projects in Malaga, including the Teatro del Soho, a theater project that reflected his desire to contribute something lasting to his hometown. It was not simply about returning home, it was about deciding what he wanted his life to mean. And then there was family. Antonio's relationship with Melanie Griffith had ended in divorce, but their connection did not disappear. They remained close and continued to share a bond through their daughter, Stella. Their relationship became an unusual example of how 2 people can move beyond a marriage ending without allowing bitterness to define the rest of their lives. For Antonio, family had become part of the bigger picture. Hollywood was still there. The movies were still there. The fame was still there. But they no longer appeared to be the only things that mattered. That may be the most important part of his story. The heart attack did not simply remind Antonio that life could end. It reminded him that life was already happening. There was a difference. For years he had been building a remarkable career, always moving toward the next project, the next role, the next opportunity. After the heart attack, he began looking at the present differently. He wanted to enjoy the people around him. He wanted to create something meaningful. He wanted to reconnect with the place that had shaped him. And he wanted to spend the years ahead with a different understanding of what success really meant. That does not mean the experience was easy. A heart attack is not a gift. It is a frightening medical emergency that can change a person's life in an instant. But Antonio's response to it is what makes the story extraordinary. He did not pretend that nothing had happened. He allowed the experience to change him. Years later, that perspective became even clearer. When asked about the heart attack, Antonio explained that it ultimately led him to make positive changes in his life. That is difficult to imagine when looking at the event itself. At the time, it was terrifying. Looking back, it became a dividing line. There was the life before the heart attack, and there was the life after it. Before, Antonio Banderas was focused on the future. Afterward, he seemed more interested in appreciating the present, and perhaps that is why his story connects with so many people. Because eventually, almost everyone reaches a moment when success stops being the most important thing. Aging changes priorities, loss changes priorities, family changes priorities, and sometimes a frightening moment reminds us that time is not something we can keep postponing. Antonio Banderas still has the movies, he still has the fame, he still has the iconic roles that made audiences remember his name. But today, his legacy is becoming about something larger. It is about knowing when to change direction. It is about understanding that a second chance does not have to look like the first life you built. Sometimes it can be quieter, sometimes it can be closer to home, and sometimes it can be more meaningful. The world first knew Antonio Banderas as a Hollywood star, but perhaps the most important chapter of his life began when he was forced to stop and ask himself what truly mattered. The heart attack changed his life, but it did not end his story. It gave him a reason to live the next chapter differently. And maybe that is the lesson Antonio Banderas will leave behind. We spend so much of life chasing the future that we forget how valuable the present really is. Sometimes it takes a moment that reminds us life can change in an instant to finally make us appreciate the life we already have.